Senator Chris Hansen knew about this, and he was less than transparent and honest with the voters of his district. He decided he would rather be able to control his successor rather than resign his seat, which is what a public servant should do, and allow voters to decide. Instead, he's going to allow a vacancy committee to decide. And it just is, it's the lack of integrity and the lack of transparency and all of that. And to your point, Jake, he's been the architect of some of the most, what will be some of the most costly bills, and the bills that will threaten our ability to power our state reliably and affordably. He's been the architect on those bills.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host Amy Cooke. And this week we got a little bit of a busy episode because we're going to touch on multiple topics, starting off with a nice little legislative update. State Senator Chris Hansen, who represents Denver, and he's also been the architect of many of the energy and environmental bills we've talked about over the course of this show, announced that he is stepping down and resigning his seat to become the CEO of La Plata, which is an electrical co-op in Southwest Colorado, effective pretty much right when the legislative session is supposed to start.
Yeah, I think he's waiting one day.
Yeah, one day.
Right afterwards. So the first day right after the first day of the session. Yeah.
So a vacancy committee will be filling that spot, which has become the norm in Colorado legislative politics. There was at one point last year, I think a third of the legislature was vacancy appointed, so no one got to vote on these folks. And now one of the most powerful senators in the state legislature will soon be replaced by a similar process.
By a vacancy committee. And he won overwhelmingly. It wasn't as if he was in any kind of...
It's a safe district.
Yeah, it's a safe district for him. So there are a couple of things on that. Being the CEO of the La Plata County Co-op is... it's not a low-paying job. Nope. It's a fairly high-paying. And I think the job listing was somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 based on experience. So on the low end, if you have to scrape by, you're scraping by with $400,000. And I think the job posting was, the closing date was middle of July.
Yeah.
So we'll put it this way. Senator Chris Hansen knew about this. He knew about it. He applied, or however that happened. He applied, and he was less than transparent and honest with the voters of his district. And this idea that another vacancy committee, a vacancy committee can be as small as 3 people.
Right.
So you could have 3 people in that district. Essentially what Senator Hansen did, and he knew about it even as he was running. My guess is he probably had the job even towards, who knows when he found out in the cycle, but he decided he would rather be able to control his successor rather than resign his seat, which is what a public servant should do, and allow voters to decide. Instead, he's going to allow a vacancy committee to decide. And it just is, it's the lack of integrity and the lack of transparency and all of that. And to your point, Jake, he's been the architect of some of the most, what will be some of the most costly bills, and the bills that will threaten our ability to power our state reliably and affordably. He's been the architect on those bills. None of those bills, even though what I think is interesting, he didn't sit on energy.
Yeah.
But it all went through him.
Yep.
It all went through him.
Like I said, some of the biggest ones, clean heat plans.
The state, what was SB, he was a sponsor of the Fenberg rider.
Yeah.
And then the other one, state's climate action goals.
Right.
that one went through, which was the state heat, which was the heat plan and all of that kind of stuff.
Local siting of renewables, I think, where the
Yep.
state is going to help dictate where local governments can site renewables and how they should site them. So yeah, this is a guy that was deep in all of the climate and energy and environmental bills that left the legislature. So there's potential, policymaking ramifications from his departure. We don't know who yet the vacancy committee is going to pick.
But since he's going to be probably instrumental in picking that person or being able to control his successor, I have to imagine as somebody who agrees with his philosophy of wind, solar, and batteries, and no nuclear.
Yep. That's exactly right. So we'll keep you up to date on what happens with that. But that's obviously big energy news in Colorado. But staying on the topic of personnel at the federal level.
And energy.
Yeah. We have the first idea of who is going to be heading up the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. President-elect Trump has tapped Lee Zeldin, who is a former congressman. He ran for governor of New York 2 years ago to head that agency. So we have some idea of where that's going to go.
So the Environmental Protection Agency, assuming he is confirmed, will be run by former Congressman Lee Zeldin. Now, especially people who have been in these circles. So I was on President Trump's transition team for EPA in 2016. And Lee Zeldin just wasn't a name that ever percolated.
Right.
Now, he was a congressman at that time from Long Island, from New York, and a popular one. And by the way, his race against Kathy Hochul was relative, it was close. It wasn't as if he got slaughtered in there. It was pretty close. So he's popular. But there are a couple of things about Lee Zeldin. One, I think he's an attorney. If I remember correctly, I think he's an attorney. He knows his way around Capitol Hill, and that matters for this particular appointment. And the reason is every state or every agency has to, with all of the climate goals that have been set by the federal government, all of those, every other agency has to go through EPA.
Right.
It is a weird thing. When we got there in 2016, it was about an $8.6 billion agency, which for Congress is, that's in Nancy Pelosi's, the cushions of her couch in her congressional office. So it's not very big, but their authority was outsized because these agencies would have to come through and essentially get some kind of anointing by the EPA as, it's okay if you do this. It wasn't as if it was in the rules, but it was sort of the way things worked. At least that was the impression that we got in 2016. So what you have is a congressman who's been on the Hill. He's an attorney. He knows how DC works, and he knows President Trump personally, President-elect Trump, and he knows what he wants, and he will carry out President Trump's agenda regarding the EPA. Now, let me go back to 2016 when I was there on the transition team. First of all, we had no idea who the appointment was going to be. We were working on the agency action plans, had no idea. In fact, we didn't know who was going to be appointed, I think, until the end of December, beginning of January. I mean, it was that late. It may have even been later than that. But I can't remember exactly. But if you probably don't remember who it was in 2016, where you were probably in high school.
That's college.
It was the Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt.
Pruitt, that's right.
And if you remember, he also left about 16 months later under federal investigation.
Yeah.
The guy was under investigation for spending forever. It was really, maybe he was guilty of it. He could have been, but it was definitely a targeted investigation, and some of it had to do with how he was utilizing federal government resources, as if the federal government suddenly cares about money. What they care about the money when it's somebody they don't like. And Scott Pruitt was somebody they don't like, but he was only there for about 16 months. EPA went through several different administrators, And I think Lee Zeldin offers a stability for the president-elect, Donald Trump, that he wants in that agency, because my guess is there's going to be reforms on NEPA, some other things, also just
Power plant rule.
Yeah, power plant rule. Let's see, LNG exports. There are a lot of things that are going to be coming out of that, out of EPA, that they need to change for President-elect Trump to get his agenda on energy through.
Yeah, especially because that was one of the biggest focal points of his campaign, especially EVs. EVs was and the tailpipe rule came out of the EPA. So a lot of consequential stuff has come out of the EPA over the last decade or so.
Permits on drilling.
Yep.
So, I mean, listen, the list is endless.
Yeah, so for our purposes of the show, it is probably the most consequential federal agency in terms of policy making. So we just wanted to give you guys that update. Obviously, President-elect Trump hasn't taken office yet. Lee Zeldin hasn't been confirmed yet, but there's reasonable confidence that he will be.
I think he gets through.
Yeah, and so obviously we'll stay on top of what goes on with that agency because it has ramifications right here in Colorado. And then the final story we wanted to talk about today actually came out of Utility Dive. So NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, so PUC members nationwide, this is their member body, is having their annual meeting. And evidently there was a panel that involved Black Hills Energy and Southwest Power Pool, which is the RTO to our east, which by all accounts, most of Colorado's utilities will soon be a part of. But essentially the headline of this is gas-fired generation likely needed to maintain reliability for years, says SPP and Black Hills. Sounds like something we might have said a time or two.
I know. When I saw it, I just... Yes, and they said the quiet part out loud. Right. The only other person in Colorado or entity in Colorado that's been saying that is the Colorado Springs Utility and their CEO, who's like, "You guys don't seem to know. You're not seeing what I'm seeing, or you're interpreting it differently." So they said out loud, "We have to have natural gas, and we have to have natural gas for a while."
Right.
Like you're not going to just shut it off. And I love that because it was the Southwest Power Pool, the RTO, which to your point is probably where, I mean, if Colorado ends up in a regional transmission organization, a show for another day is how Colorado is a little bit like its own mini RTO, but that's a show for another day. But that it's a sizable warning.
Right.
So as we talk about cost, there's cost, but then they're saying this for reliability purposes.
Yep. Yeah. There's a quote from Mark Lux, who's their vice president for power delivery, and I want to read it because it really just
is good.
Cuts to the heart of it. He said, hopefully there's a replacement technology other than gas that can provide that reliability, but today gas is the reliability option of choice and will be for at least a decade. And he talks specifically about Colorado, which obviously Black Hills, their service territory is in southern Colorado. And he mentions, Black Hills is in Colorado, we're adding solar, we're adding wind, we're adding batteries because we're trying to meet the state's carbon emissions goals, their mandates essentially. But he mentions that wind turbines trip offline when temperatures exceed 104 degrees or fall below 20 degrees below zero, leading to periods when gas-fired generation serves all of the utility's load. Talk about a linchpin of your power system. There's times where he's quite literally saying it's all gas. We need it to keep the lights on. Sometimes it's all gas, and that's why he's saying for at least a decade they're going to need gas.
And let's go back to so 20 degrees below zero.
Right.
By the way, those of us on the plains, we don't see that temperature often.
But it happens.
And by the way, that is the last time that is not when you want to find out your power's out.
Right.
And that's why, here's the other danger of all of this. With wind, solar, and batteries, we've talked about it on numerous shows, we are going to a winter peaking system.
Yep.
Winter peaking system, meaning the biggest demand will be in the winter. Currently, we're a summer peaking system. Biggest demand is in summer because of air conditioning. This means the load growth is in the winter, and that is when they stop working at 20 degrees below zero.
Right.
And that happens. And that is not a time you want to be without power.
And that's just for temperature reasons, right? There's all sorts of reasons in the winter
Yeah.
why you wouldn't have good wind generation. A lot of times when snow fronts come in, it's very still. Every Coloradan can relate to this. You step outside, you see a blanket of snow on the ground, and it's as still as can be. It sounds so
That's
quiet.
right.
And that happens all the time. The Germans call it Dunkelflaut when you have the overcast and no wind. That happens in Colorado winters. So it's not just when you get extreme temperatures. It could just be just a typical winter day or winter night when gas is really going to be coming to the rescue.
It'll also do it if the wind is too high.
That's right.
They have to shut them down too.
That's a good
so
point.
if you have, and we know that the wind blows on the Eastern Plains, but there are times when it blows too hard and you have to shut down. They call that a wind event.
Right.
We're having an event. It's called high winds. You have to shut down the turbines because they can't run at, I think it's above 50 miles an hour. Now, does it get above 50 miles an hour a lot? No, but it does happen. I'll tell you the time you don't want it to happen is when it's bitter cold.
Right. It happens frequently enough that it warrants being a little concerned about. I do want to touch on Southwest Power Pool in this because they also talk a little bit about what we're talking about now. Their vice president of operations mentions that they're forecasting about 30 gigawatts of wind over the next week. They have 34 gigawatts of wind on the system, so that's pretty good output. But he says it could fall to 5,000 megawatts in that period. How do we manage that? We've got to keep a diverse portfolio. We've got to have something to keep the lights on. It ideally would be as economic and as clean as possible. But right now, the best option we have for generation over the next several years looks like it's natural gas. Same thing coming out of the Southwest Power Pool's mouth. And that matters because, like we said at the top of the show, or top of this segment, Colorado is probably by 2030 looking at joining that RTO. We talked about last week's episode. The governor's office is already very concerned about Colorado's costs and reliability.
Right. Southwest
Power Pool is currently having the same problems. They put out an advisory about what they call planned reserve margins, meaning the stuff that a percentage of capacity that they need to have ready to go in case peak demand goes crazy or a wind turbine doesn't show up. They just, for the first time, are requiring their member utilities to have a 16% summer season planned reserve margin and a 36% winter season planned reserve margin. For those that think I'm speaking a different language right now, a typical planned reserve margin is usually between 10 to 12% for most utilities. So this means they are very, very concerned. They're concerned about summer, but they're extremely concerned about winter system reliability.
Because we're going to winter peaking systems. Yep. We can't say that enough.
Right.
The switch for that, because people die when it's bitter cold. Winter Storm Uri. Think about that. 246 people have died. We've talked about that ad nauseum on this show, but there's a reason for it. Winter peaking systems, your margins have to be much greater, because even though hot is uncomfortable, and yes, people will die in summer, we've seen that, but it is much more of a threat in winter when the temperatures are bitter cold. More people die from cold weather than they do from warm weather. The other thing is 36%. I wrap your mind around that. 36%. You need to have that as a reserve margin.
Right.
So the massive overbuilding
That's exactly right.
that we have to pay for to get to a 36% reserve margin is huge. And we're going to pay for it.
Right. That's a massive amount of capacity that's going to sit idle most of the time,
That's
essentially.
right.
But it still has to be paid for, right? They still have costs to cover. And so that means that you're worried about reliability, you're paying all this for extra standby capacity, and you just might need it. The other thing about what makes winter peaking systems so the concept of that with unreliable power so scary is, say what you want about the intermittency of solar, but at least in the summertime you can count on solar showing up during the day.
Well, for a little longer period of time.
Right, at least during the day, right? You can't always count on that in the wintertime. Even during the daytime, you can have overcast skies. So that's taking out a huge chunk of planned capacity in states like Colorado, where they're banking on solar being the backbone of the grid. What happens if it's overcast and you don't get any solar during the day?
And I am reminded of what happened in North Carolina in Christmas 2022, where they had to institute rolling blackouts. I think that was part of Winter Storm Elliott.
Yeah.
I could be, but Winter Storm Elliott, where Duke Energy underestimated demand based on the weather forecast. So they also missed the forecast on really on the temperature. Temperature got much colder than they had anticipated. So they missed the forecast, and so peak demand was higher. They had some mechanical failures, so they lost some power there. And then the power that they had purchased, so they had purchased backup power, but remember, it was a regional event. So the power that they had purchased, nothing they can do if it doesn't show up.
Right.
And it didn't, because those selling it needed it in their own areas. So the demand was greater. There was some mechanical failures, and then there was the purchased power didn't materialize. So I love this line, because Duke, they asked about renewables when they showed up in testimony. Duke was asked about renewables. There's a lot of installed solar in North Carolina. And Duke's response was, it performed as expected, which means it wasn't there, because it was at night in the winter. There's no solar at night. So it performed as expected. And I loved how the wind and solar sycophants, oh my gosh, see, Duke even acknowledged it. Solar did its job, yet didn't have one. So it was it did its job, which was nothing. It wasn't expected to perform. What did do its job was nuclear. Right across. Nuclear showed up. It's a workhorse. It's a base load. It is a reliable, in North Carolina, reliable 10,000 megawatts of power, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. In Colorado, we don't consider nuclear. So it does beg the question, until some other technology comes online. So what is that other technology? Well, in Colorado, what they think that's going to be is hydrogen.
Yeah.
It's not. It's just not. But the Colorado Energy Office is telling you, and Governor Polis is telling you, hydrogen will do it. No, it won't. No, they won't say in public what everyone is saying privately, which is that hydrogen won't be the technology. What we do need is probably nuclear to do it. But for right now, it's natural gas. So get used to it.
Right. Like you said, they're essentially saying the quiet part out loud that we've been saying for a while now, is you can try to demonize these gas plants all you want and set these grandiose visions of what Colorado's energy system is going to look like in some truncated timeline. But all the people that are actually in charge of keeping the lights on and keeping people's power flowing to their homes are saying, yeah, gas ain't going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah.
As we're coming up on time here, Amy, do you have any takeaways for our listeners of any of the three segments that we covered today?
Just a couple of things. Thanks to Black Hills and Southwest Power Pool, we should all thank them for saying the quiet part out loud, the stuff that we know. And I hope others in Colorado start to get a backbone and say this stuff. It can't just be you and me and the Colorado Springs utilities and Black Hills and Southwest Power Pool. We need people to stand up and start acknowledging this. So that's one. La Plata County customers, hold on to your wallets. And here's the other thing. For sure, you should get a generator. For sure, get a generator.
Great advice, as always. That does it for us on another episode of PowerGab. If you like what you saw here, you can head on over to powergab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We produce new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple. And if you would like to suggest future show topics for us or suggest a guest that you'd like to see us interview, you can send those over to info@powergab.org. We'd love to hear from our listeners. But until next week, we'll see you.